Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. It began on a Monday, under a sky so gray it seemed to borrow its sadness from the lives below. The streets of Enugu stirred with their usual hum, vendors calling out in rehearsed voices, Danfo buses coughing thick clouds into the morning air, children in oversized uniforms chasing after time they barely understood. In the midst of that routine chaos, Nora Delton stepped out of her compound with her handbag pressed tightly to her ribs, her spirit oddly heavy for a woman who had just earned a new title. The sun had not yet broken through the clouds, and somehow it suited her mood. Her flat shoes tapped the concrete as she walked to the junction to catch her staff bus, her mind running over slides, figures, and the upcoming pitch she'd lead at noon. 6 years of unpaid overtime, forgotten birthdays, and lonely dinners had finally landed her the role of head of regional analytics at Z-Tech Solutions, a position that only a few women before her had held. But that morning, her chest ached, not from fear, but from an eerie anticipation she couldn't place. Something about the silence in her building, the dull ache in her lower back, the reluctant way the day greeted her, all felt like a warning whispered in a language her heart had forgotten how to translate. By the time she reached the company's Enugu branch, a towering glass structure nestled between a private hospital and an event center, she had already tucked her unease into a quiet corner of her mind. The security guard at the gate, Chuka, gave her a brief nod and opened the gate without his usual grin. She noticed it, but said nothing. Inside the building, the air conditioning blasted harder than usual, and the scent of fresh polish made her eyes sting slightly. Nora walked past the reception, heels no longer silent on the newly buffed tiles, and offered a nod to Grace, the new intern who never seemed to blink. As she made her way to her office on the second floor, she sensed the shift in the air, the way conversations died when she appeared, the way eyes flicked away a little too quickly. In a company like Z-Tech, silence wasn't just silence, it was language. And this silence screamed. Her office door was ajar when she arrived, and on her table sat a manila envelope she hadn't left the night before. She picked it up slowly, the way someone might pick up a letter from a loved one who had passed, half expecting warmth, half dreading what lay within. She opened it with a paper knife, her fingers trembling without her permission, and scanned the contents. The numbers on the printed sheets didn't make sense, not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were dangerously wrong. Wrong in a way that had consequences measured in millions. Her heart raced, but her feet stayed planted. She read the document twice, then a third time, her brow furrowed deeper with each pass. It was a financial report, one tied to the Cross River Smart Grid project, a deal so crucial it had been described as Z-Tech's most significant move into infrastructure consulting. According to the document, Nora's projections had resulted in a misallocation of nearly 780 million Nigerian nairas. The client had pulled out, the firm was under fire, and every piece of the report bore her signature, her department seal, her timestamp. Except Nora had never seen the numbers before that morning. A knock at the door snapped her from her thoughts. It was Mr. Dapo, the branch director, flanked by 2 members of the audit team. "You'll need to come with us," he said, his voice flat, his eyes avoiding hers. She followed them in silence, past the open-plan workspace where heads dipped awkwardly or stared just long enough to confirm what they had already heard. A few whispered. One man chuckled. Another woman clutched her phone like it had just started ringing. When she stepped into the boardroom, the cool air felt colder than usual, and the lights hummed above her like a choir of electric judgment. They sat her down without small talk. No coffee, no pleasantries, just a stack of documents and faces hardened into decision. Mr. Dapo opened with a statement that sounded rehearsed. "Nora, it has come to our attention that the financial forecast you submitted for the smart grid proposal was not only inaccurate, but disastrous to our engagement with the client. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your role as head of regional analytics. You will be reassigned to a junior analyst position pending further review." He slid a printed HR letter across the table like a final insult. Nora's mouth went dry. Her first instinct was to speak, to explain that the numbers were alien to her, that she had nothing to do with that report, but the weight in the room was too much. Her voice cracked when she finally managed to ask for a chance to investigate. "The damage is done," Dapo replied, not unkindly, but with the indifference of a man who had already chosen where to place his loyalty. She stood up slowly, more conscious of her body than she had ever been. The room blurred around the edges. As she stepped out, the first laugh came from behind her, light, dismissive, almost polite. But it was enough. Enough to start a chain of snickering, giggles, and half-hidden smirks as she walked past desks that once buzzed with respect for her. She didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later. Back in her office, now no longer hers, she found a brown carton under the desk. Someone had already packed her things, her mug with the faded "Keep Going" inscription, the family photo from 3 Christmases ago, her pen holder, and the stress ball she never used. Each item felt like a betrayal. She carried the box through the same hallways where junior staff once scrambled to greet her, past the glass walls where she had pitched million-naira ideas, past the kitchen where she once cheered a colleague through a breakup. Every step was an insult. Even the elevator seemed slower than usual, groaning under the weight of her shame. The ride to the ground floor stretched like a punishment. When the doors opened, she kept her chin up, even as another pair of junior analysts muttered something and chuckled as she passed. Outside, the sun had finally pierced the clouds, but it offered no warmth. She walked to the bus stop alone, the city's noise swallowing her like a mouthful of regret. And as she waited for a cab, still clutching her box, a single thought anchored itself in her mind like a nail hammered into wood. Someone set me up. She didn't know who or why. But that thought, quiet, bitter, defiant, was the only thing that kept her from crumbling right there on the roadside. Nora sat by the window of her flat in Abakaliki, her eyes tracing the path of a gecko as it slowly crept across the wall outside. The ceiling fan above her clicked with every rotation, a hollow metronome marking the passage of time that now felt more like a weight than a flow. Since the day of her demotion, the days had stretched long and slow, like thick molasses poured onto a cold plate. Her phone had gone silent almost immediately. Colleagues who once buzzed her with late-night questions or casual gossip now avoided even her WhatsApp status. A single, "How are you holding up?" came from a former team member in Ngozi, but it was quickly followed by a voice note about a new opening in Port Harcourt, as though Nora was expected to flee in shame. The suggestion felt like someone politely asking her to vanish. The silence of abandonment wasn't just loud, it was deafening. Her living room, which once held a sense of quiet productivity, now seemed swollen with echoes. Her laptop sat on the center table, still open to the same sheet she'd been staring at for hours, a spreadsheet of her previous projects, as if trying to find something in her own work that would explain the betrayal. But there was nothing. No misplaced decimal. No miscalculated margin. Just a wall of accuracy, stretching like a mirror that refused to lie. She knew, in her bones, that someone else had pulled the strings. But knowing was not proof, and without proof, her truth was nothing more than a bitter whisper. That night, unable to sleep, Nora stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked the street. The neighborhood had settled into its usual rhythm of distant generator hums, the faint barking of restless dogs, and the occasional shout from the nearby bar that stayed open past reason. She leaned against the railing, her fingers tightening around the cold metal. The ache inside her chest had taken a new shape, less sadness, more heat. Not anger, exactly, but something deeper, more primal. A need for understanding. A need to claw at the fog until the source of the fire revealed itself. If this were a movie, she thought, there would be some grand clue hidden in plain sight, a dramatic twist, or a sudden confession. But this was not a movie. It was life in all its messy indifference. Still, she couldn't ignore what she had begun to feel, that her assistant, Ava, might not be as innocent as she pretended to be. Ava had always hovered, eager, quick to offer help, but also curiously silent on the day of Nora's fall. While the others gossiped or glanced away, Ava had simply avoided her gaze completely. Not out of guilt. No, that would have been too generous, but out of calculation. Nora replayed the timeline over and over in her mind, focusing on the week leading up to the demotion. There was the night she had forgotten her laptop in the conference room after a long strategy session. Ava had volunteered to close up. At the time, it had seemed thoughtful. Now, it looked like the first move in a carefully plotted game. By the third day, her restlessness evolved into action. With nowhere else to channel her thoughts, she returned to her files, this time with the precision of a detective rather than an employee. Her home internet was patchy, so she went to a quiet cafe tucked behind a bank in the city center, where the generator was dependable and the staff minded their business. She ordered a bottle of malt and set up her system, her hands already typing commands before the drink arrived. First, She combed through her email archive, looking for anything that seemed out of place. There were dozens of automated messages, team threads, memos she had ignored in the haze of office work. Then she checked her version histories on Google Drive. Most of the core documents were exactly as she had left them. But the Smart Grid report had no trace in her cloud history. That made no sense. She always drafted there before printing. She paused. If the final copy didn't originate from her drive, then where did it come from? She logged into the company's shared folder, using a saved login she had forgotten to delete from her browser. What she found unsettled her more than she expected. The version of the report with her name on it had been uploaded from a different IP address, one she didn't recognize, but the document's style, phrasing, and formatting mimicked hers almost perfectly. Every sentence sounded like her voice on paper, yet something was off. There was an extra space before the decimal points in all the currency figures, something she never did. Nora leaned back, chills running down her spine. It wasn't just sabotage, it was impersonation. As the sun began to set, casting golden strips across her screen, she discovered something she hadn't expected. A file tucked deep within the final drafts folder had been shared to her personal email 2 weeks earlier by mistake. She had ignored it, assuming it was spam. But when she clicked it now, her breath caught in her throat. It was a string of forwarded emails between Ava and Brian, a business strategist she had always found too slick for his own good. The conversation was partially redacted, but enough remained to paint the outline of a plan. We'll position it as her mistake. Let Depo handle the cleanup. Get the client to delay signing until we reset the terms. It was all there. Not in outright admissions, but in the kind of guarded language used by people who know they're doing something wrong. What struck Nora hardest wasn't the betrayal. It was the calculation. These weren't decisions made in panic. They were planned piece by piece, while she had stayed up preparing pitch decks and reviewing forecast models. She sat frozen in that cafe chair, her malt still untouched, the room suddenly too warm despite the humming air conditioner. The rage came slowly, quietly. It wasn't a thunderclap. It was a simmer, the kind that didn't cool, the kind that grew teeth. Ava and Brian hadn't just stolen her title. They had stolen her identity. They had sold her name to the fire and walked away smelling of perfume and new titles. But now they had left footprints. Nora woke the next morning before the first cock crowed. She hadn't truly slept. Her body had merely shut down from exhaustion in the early hours, sprawled awkwardly on her couch, her laptop screen still casting a soft light across the room like a silent witness. The emails, the fabricated report, the inconsistencies, all of it now floated before her in pieces, and her mind played them on loop like an unfinished song she couldn't stop humming. The document wasn't just altered, it was deliberately crafted. The familiar turns of phrase she often used were replicated with such precision it sent a chill through her. Whoever had done this had studied her style closely, mimicking her tone and formatting with an unsettling level of intimacy. She stood and shuffled to the kitchen, her feet cold against the tile. As she made tea, her eyes remained glazed, and her thoughts flicked back to Ava's eager face, the face that had once looked up to her as a mentor. Nora recalled how, during team reviews, Ava had often asked about her approach to client reports, even going as far as requesting templates for learning purposes. At the time, it had felt flattering. Now it felt like giving a thief the spare keys. The kettle whistled. She poured, sat at the dining table, and began mapping everything she knew, pen on paper, forming links between dates, times, and actions. Something new emerged as she listed them. The day she'd left her laptop in the boardroom, and the sudden shift in Brian's tone the next morning. There had been no reason for Brian to even comment on the Cross River project. He wasn't on that team, yet he had casually mentioned, "I hope your projections hold water, Nora. Would be a shame if we lost that client." At the time, it sounded like a joke. Now it read like foreshadowing. She dressed quickly and left the house with a small backpack containing her laptop, hard drive, notebook, and a few printed pages of the most suspicious emails. Rather than returning to the cafe she had used the day before, she chose a quieter location, an underused co-working space at the edge of town, close to the Abakaliki waterboard, where few professionals gathered on weekdays. It offered fewer eyes, fewer questions. She signed in with a false name, Lolo Mateo, and paid for a single desk facing the window. From there, she began to trace the electronic trail with a kind of obsession that frightened even her. She wasn't tech-savvy in the way coders were, but she had a sharp memory and a meticulous approach to data. She knew where digital dust gathered and how to follow it. First, she accessed old team calendars, checking which nights she and Ava had both stayed late. She cross-referenced that with IP login records she could still access using cached admin privileges from her former role. That was when the break came. On the night of the forged report's upload, Ava had logged into the system twice, once under her own credentials and once, oddly, under a temporary login labeled Trainee X. Nora remembered approving temporary access months ago for interns, but had revoked them afterward. Someone had reactivated one. Ava had logged in through that ghost account, masking her presence. But what exposed her wasn't the login, it was what she forgot to do after. In her haste, she saved a draft file under her own initials in a deep folder marked Internal Dev. The file itself was empty, but the metadata confirmed what Nora needed. She copied the logs and saved them in a hidden folder on her external drive. It was the first real proof tying Ava's actions to the falsified report. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her email to write a formal report to the board, then paused. She stared at the blinking cursor for nearly 20 minutes. Something didn't sit right. Not yet. This wasn't the right time to act. Not with emotions still raw. She needed one more piece of evidence, something that would not just prove sabotage but render denial impossible. Later that evening, Nora walked the uneven roads of GRA, thinking. The town was beginning to shift into evening, and she passed food vendors fanning flames beneath blackened pots, children skipping with threadbare ropes, and elderly women washing clothes in front of small bungalows. The streets whispered of old wounds and slow healing. She had grown up in McCourty, but Abakaliki was where she had built herself professionally, brick by silent brick. She passed a small suya stand and stopped, not for the food, but because her eyes caught the back of a familiar head seated beside the vendor's bench. It was Brian. His unmistakable posture, straight back, crossed legs, one hand fiddling with his phone, was hard to miss. She slowed and watched from a distance. Moments later, Ava arrived. She handed him an envelope, small and crisp. They didn't hug. They didn't smile. It was too businesslike for friends, too tense for lovers. Ava looked around once, nervously, before walking away in the opposite direction. Nora's heart pounded. She stayed in the shadows, waiting 5 minutes before slipping away herself. The air felt hotter now, pressing against her skin like thick oil. If there had been doubt before, it was gone now. She returned to her flat in silence, her thoughts sharper than they'd been in days. She transferred every single piece of evidence to a locked folder, encrypting it with a passphrase only she could remember. Not me _7781. It was a code that meant something only to her, the number of days she'd worked at Z-Tech before they turned on her. The next morning, she made an unannounced visit to the Cross River client. Her request was strange, but polite. "Can I speak with your procurement head for 10 minutes? Off record." After some hesitation, they agreed. What she heard during that conversation stunned her. The client had never pulled out. In fact, they had been waiting on Z-Tech's final signature for nearly 2 weeks. They had even followed up with Brian via email, who had responded that Nora was no longer available to manage the deal. A lie wrapped in casual wording. Nora thanked them, excused herself, and stepped out into the sun, her hands trembling from adrenaline. Her name had not just been dragged, it had been erased, scrubbed clean from her own work. But now she had the match to set fire to the lies. The cab ride back was quiet, but her mind thundered. The streets of Calabar faded behind her as the car bounced over potholes, her body rocked but her resolve firm. Nora now understood the full breadth of what had been done. They hadn't just wanted her position, they wanted her removal to look like a natural fall, a slow crumbling of her own doing. It wasn't about an error, it was about engineering a collapse that looked too real to question. It was surgical, precise. She looked out at the passing trees, her fingers still tight around her bag. In it were printed emails, login histories, draft reports, and the client confirmation. Proof, not theories. She didn't call her lawyer yet. She didn't report to the board. She needed more than legal recourse. She needed clarity on one last thing, what Ava and Brian hoped to gain. It couldn't just be her job. The scale of deception suggested something bigger, maybe a partnership, maybe access to another contract she didn't know about yet. She began making inquiries into the project registry. By evening, she discovered a sealed memo sent to senior management proposing a new branch in Port Harcourt to handle what was described as strategic redirection. It had been co-signed by Brian and Ava. The project was valued at nearly 2.8 billion Nigerian nairas. Nora's name was absent, but the data models used in the memo, Word for word, they had come from the pitch she had given weeks earlier. Her proposal, her slides, her research, even the placeholder name for the branch, Z-Tech Riverline, was something she had casually joked about during lunch with Ava. That was the final crack in the mask. Nora sat in her kitchen that night with the lights off, just her and the hum of the fridge, staring at a printed copy of the Riverline proposal. It no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like war. And Nora had just found her sword. The weekend crept in slowly, with rain that wouldn't fully fall, just tapping at her windows like a child too polite to knock hard. Nora sat curled in her chair by the window, watching the drops struggle against the dry harmattan air. The files were spread across her table like puzzle pieces. Printed emails with red markings, login histories, her original project documents, and that one forwarded memo proposing the new Port Harcourt expansion. The further she read, the more disturbing it became. Brian and Ava hadn't just stolen her proposal. They had expanded on it, crudely, but enough to pass. The presentation used her formatting style, her phrasing, even some of her graphs. It was like watching a poorly acted version of her own mind. What pierced her deeper wasn't just the theft, it was the audacity. They believed she wouldn't fight back, that she would shrink under humiliation, that she'd walk away, dignity broken, and let the world assume she had failed because she simply wasn't good enough. Her stomach clenched at the thought. She closed her eyes briefly and remembered the day she had pitched that project, how she stood before a room of distracted executives, speaking over rustling papers and the occasional cough, fighting for their attention with every carefully chosen word. Ava had sat in the corner that day, pretending to take notes. Nora now realized she had been taking something else entirely. The betrayal ran so deep it made her skin crawl. But she wasn't going to break. She had found her footing in the storm, and now the storm would have to answer to her. She reached out to Amaka that evening, a former classmate from UNN, who had since become a legal advisor for a mid-tier commercial law firm in Lagos. They hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years, but when Nora's call came through, Amaka didn't hesitate. "I heard about the demotion," she said after the first few seconds of small talk. "But I didn't believe it. You don't make mistakes like that. What really happened?" Nora hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a tone neither bitter nor broken, just precise. She detailed the sequence of events, the digital trail, the client meeting, the duplicate proposal, and the sealed memo for the Port Harcourt project. Amaka didn't interrupt once. By the time Nora finished, there was silence on the line. Then Amaka cleared her throat. "Nora, what you're describing isn't just sabotage. It's corporate fraud, intellectual theft, possibly collusion. And Z-Tech could be liable if they acted on manipulated data without due diligence." Those words wrapped themselves around Nora's heart, not as comfort, but as confirmation. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't dramatic. She was right. "Do you want this handled quietly or publicly?" Amaka asked, her voice more serious now. Nora looked out her window, watched a boy walking barefoot through the red earth with a plastic bottle tied to a stick, dragging it behind him like a kite. "I want them to remember," she said quietly. "Not just for what they did to me, but for thinking I wouldn't fight back." Amaka agreed to send her a list of required evidence, formal complaint templates, and scheduled a Zoom call for Monday morning. Nora ended the call feeling not victorious, but awake. On Sunday, she returned to Enugu quietly and booked a room in a small hotel not far from Z-Tech's regional headquarters. It wasn't luxury, just clean walls, a working shower, and silence. From there, she reviewed every detail again, not for mistakes, but for strength. She practiced what she would say to the board. Not in front of a mirror, but to the walls of the hotel room, to the ceiling, to the night. She knew how these people thought, how they softened around facts, how they buried embarrassment beneath procedural jargon. They would not admit their failure willingly. She would have to make it too expensive to ignore. By evening, she was ready. She sent Amaka scanned copies of all relevant documents, video recordings of her computer session, where she demonstrated the metadata and version histories, and a timeline of key events. Amaka responded quickly. "This is more than enough. Send me their legal contact." Nora smiled faintly, for the first time in days. But even in that moment of strategy, she couldn't shake the emotional toll. The people who had eaten from the palm of her kindness had turned around and used her like a tool, discarded her as though her years of effort were as light as dust. She stepped out of the hotel room for air, letting the cool evening settle over her skin. The city lights blinked in the distance, blurred by harmattan haze. She watched people walk by, ordinary lives still untouched by betrayal or revenge, and wondered if she would ever return to that innocence again. Her mind said no, but her heart hadn't yet accepted the answer. Monday morning arrived with a quiet kind of tension, the kind that settles into your stomach before your feet touch the ground. Nora dressed in calm movements, each layer deliberate. A plain navy blue blouse, pressed black trousers, and her lowest heels, not flashy but sharp. She walked to Zteka's office with measured steps, her documents tucked securely in a sleek leather folder, the same one she had carried the day she was promoted. The receptionist raised her brows in mild surprise, but said nothing. Nora requested to see the regional board members, citing urgent legal matters. At first, the receptionist hesitated, but after a firm look and a quiet call, she was escorted upstairs. The hallway had not changed. The office walls still held their hollow motivational posters. The staff still typed as if their jobs depended on speed. But the whispers began almost immediately. Some looked away. Others stared too long. Nora said nothing. She was led into a smaller conference room. Not the boardroom, but the implication was clear, a test run. She waited 10 minutes. Then 15. Finally, Mr. Dapo and two others entered, flanked by the corporate lawyer assigned to Zteka's internal affairs. She didn't blink. She placed the documents on the table, slid them forward with the calm of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. "These materials," she began, voice clear, "prove that I was wrongfully demoted based on a falsified report prepared using unauthorized access to my profile, deliberate impersonation, and a manipulated narrative. I have metadata, email trails, and client confirmation to back every claim. You have 5 business days to begin an internal investigation and reinstate my professional record, or my lawyer will proceed with a formal lawsuit including client witnesses and breach of contract claims." The room fell into a stunned hush. Dapo opened his mouth but said nothing. The lawyer picked up the documents slowly, scanning the top page. One of the board members, whom she had never liked, cleared his throat, perhaps out of habit. No one dared to challenge her. She didn't ask if they believed her. That was no longer necessary. She stood, adjusted her folder, and walked out the same way she had entered, on her own terms. The air inside Zteka's building shifted, not dramatically, but subtly, like the way a room feels when someone walks in who doesn't belong, even though they do. For the next 3 days after Nora's confrontation, whispers bloomed like wildflowers in dry land. Staff avoided eye contact when she passed through the corridor, but no one dared speak to her directly. It was as though her presence made everyone reconsider what they thought they knew. Management moved like ghosts, faces tighter, meetings longer, and doors more frequently closed. It was no longer about the demotion. The company was suddenly facing the sharp tip of something they hadn't prepared for: accountability. Nora had not returned to her corner desk. She had no reason to. Every day that she came in, she did so without permission but also without resistance. No one asked her to leave. It was as if the institution, with all its glass walls and plastic smiles, had turned into a house of cards waiting for the wind to decide. On the 4th morning, an official internal memo was circulated, sterile in tone, as expected. It read like a confession written by committee. Ztec Solutions will be conducting an internal audit and compliance review of recent project management assignments. Any staff with information relevant to the smart grid proposal is encouraged to cooperate. That was all. No mention of Nora. No apology. No retraction. Just a cold breadcrumb dropped in a hallway of unanswered questions. She read it while sipping tea at her desk, the one that used to be hers, and felt nothing. That was how healing often began. Not with joy, but with the absence of pain. Meanwhile, Ava's confidence began to fray at the edges. Her laughter in the lunchroom became less frequent, her steps slower, her once proud shoulders pulled tighter, as though each hallway had become a gallery of suspicion. Brian, too, seemed altered. He no longer spoke with that casual arrogance that once filled every room he entered. He kept his head down, typed longer emails, scheduled more one-on-ones with the legal team. Though they hadn't yet been officially confronted, they could smell it in the air, the end creeping toward them like a slow tide. Nora watched them without gloating. Revenge, for her, wasn't in their discomfort. It was in truth finding its voice. She spent her hours tying off every loose end. Amaka, ever diligent, had already begun pre-litigation communications with Zteka's legal department. Each message was a scalpel, worded with clarity, backed with timestamps, screenshots, and language that demanded attention. What shocked Nora most was how quiet the leadership remained. No calls to negotiate. No backroom deals. Just silence. It was the silence of a building that had hoped she'd disappear, then realized she wouldn't. On Friday afternoon, she was summoned to a meeting, not with HR, not with the board, but with the executive director who usually operated from Lagos. He had flown in quietly, the way men in power do when they know something has been mishandled. His name was Mr. Tunde Owolabi, and when Nora walked into the executive suite to find him alone, seated and already reading a printed file with her name on it, she felt, for the first time, that the story was no longer just hers. It had become bigger than office politics, bigger than even her own reputation. He didn't begin with questions. Instead, he looked up from the file and gestured for her to sit. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed, but there was no arrogance in it. He asked her to walk him through everything. From the night she left her laptop in the boardroom to the morning, she stood in front of the board with a folder full of truth. She did. Slowly. With no theatrics. Just facts. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his fingers sometimes tapping the edge of the file. When she was done, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. The client confirmed your version. We reached out independently after receiving your legal communication, he said. They had no idea the project had stalled internally. The delay, it appears, was orchestrated. His words weren't a surprise, but they still felt heavy coming from him. You were wronged. Deeply, he added. This is more than a mistake, it's a liability. Nora didn't respond. Not yet. She watched him, studied him. Then he exhaled and gave a slight nod, like someone arriving at a conclusion they had resisted. We will restore your title immediately, he said. Retroactively. And all records tied to the demotion will be deleted from your file. We're also offering a direct reassignment to lead the Cross River project as intended. She waited. There was always more. He continued. Additionally, there's a proposal from the client to enter a 3-year consulting retainer with your leadership. They were insistent on that. There it was. Not just justice, but validation. Still, she didn't smile. Not yet. The storm wasn't done shaking. When she returned home that night, there was no celebration. No music. No wine. Just silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. The kind that follows truth like a shadow. She dropped her bag on the sofa, pulled off her shoes, and sat on the floor, leaning against the couch. She was exhausted, but it wasn't the exhaustion of defeat. It was the weariness that follows standing too long, too still, in the face of a rising wind. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. She needed to breathe without intrusion. Her eyes scanned the room, her modest apartment with its familiar creaks and stains and comfort, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a hiding place. It felt like a sanctuary. She remembered the look on Ava's face when she passed her in the hallway earlier that day. It wasn't fear, it was resignation. As if she knew the game had been lost, but still hadn't figured out when exactly the rules had changed. Brian hadn't shown up at the office at all. Rumors had begun to churn, the way rumors always do when guilt grows legs. Nora didn't ask. She didn't need to. She wasn't interested in their consequences anymore. That part had ended the moment she handed her folder to the board. What mattered now was forward. She picked up her phone and finally read the message Amaka had sent hours earlier. It was simple. You did it. Nora stared at the screen, then typed, "We're not done." She meant it, because even though her name had been cleared and her position reinstated, the thing that had been taken from her, her peace, her confidence, her belonging, would take time to rebuild. And she was willing to give it that time. She wasn't chasing punishment anymore. She was building a new center, one where no one else would get to define her again. The news of Nora's reinstatement didn't come as a formal announcement. There were no banners, no congratulatory memos. It came instead in the quiet adjustment of titles on internal dashboards, the subtle update of access rights to systems she'd been locked out of, the quiet click of her office door unlocking again with her old ID card. But what the building lacked in ceremony, the people inside it made up for in silence. They watched her return to the space she had been banished from just weeks earlier, their eyes darting between admiration and caution. Nora said very little. She entered the office on a humid Tuesday morning, her bag slung over her shoulder, dressed in a charcoal blouse and straight-leg slacks that made her movements look deliberate. She walked through the familiar glass corridor, past desks filled with voices that lowered as she passed, and when she reached her former office, now hers once again, she paused. Her fingers lingered on the silver handle before she pushed it open. Nothing had changed. The photo frame still leaned slightly to the right. The chair still carried the indent of whoever had last used it. But it was hers again. She stepped inside, closed the door gently behind her, and sat, not like someone reclaiming territory, but like someone accepting what should never have been taken in the first place. There was no satisfaction in her breath, only steadiness. She powered up her computer and began going through the project files for Cross River, her fingers moving quickly, not to catch up, but to reset the clock on her own terms. Outside her door, the company restructured itself without quite admitting it. HR quietly suspended Ava for procedural violations, while an internal review was initiated. Brian was advised to take indefinite leave. No statements were issued to staff. The executive team moved carefully, as though stepping around glass that had already broken underfoot. The leadership wanted to keep the scandal internal, manage the fallout before it reached any external stakeholders. Nora understood their reasoning, but it didn't impress her. In truth, she had no interest in whether Z-Tech saved face. What mattered to her was that no one else would have to bleed quietly again. She took her reinstated power seriously, not as revenge, but as responsibility. The Cross River client, now officially under her direct oversight, sent a revised contract with better terms and a quiet note from their procurement lead. We always knew something didn't add up. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition, which Nora valued more than praise. She took 2 days to redesign the full rollout plan from scratch, dismissing the outdated model Ava and Brian had tampered with. Her new team, carefully chosen from outside her old circle, watched her work with a mixture of awe and wariness. She didn't shout. She didn't command respect through volume. She just moved with the kind of clarity that silences rooms. During lunch breaks, she stayed at her desk. When colleagues asked if she was okay, she smiled politely and nodded. But underneath, she was still stitching herself back together in small, quiet ways. She had spent too many nights questioning her instincts to begin trusting the world again in a hurry. It was late on a Thursday evening when she received a call from Mr. Tund Owolabi again. His tone was softer than the first time, more reflective, like someone still reconciling with how close their organization had come to collapse. "We're creating a new integrity committee," he said. "Internal affairs. I'd like you to consider chairing it." Nora stared at her screen for a moment, where her new project tracker glowed in muted colors. "I don't know if I'm ready to sit in judgment of others," she replied, voice calm. He responded with something that stayed with her long after the call ended. "You don't need to judge anyone. You just need to make sure what happened to you never happens again." She didn't say yes that night. She needed space. The offer wasn't just a title. It was a responsibility soaked in memory. A chair that came with the weight of everything she had endured. She went home in silence, walking past the same suya vendor, the same grocery woman who now greeted her with the warm familiarity of someone who had watched a neighbor survive a storm. Inside her flat, she lay on the rug again, arms stretched over her head, eyes fixed on the ceiling. She replayed everything, from the first whisper of suspicion to the final meeting with the executive board. The entire journey had left something behind inside her, a version of herself that hadn't existed before, one who no longer needed to be seen to feel whole. One who didn't flinch at silence. She didn't cry. There were no more tears left for this part of her life. What remained was a steady kind of fire, not loud but enduring, the kind that could warm others or burn down anything that tried to harm her again. Weeks passed. The dust settled in layers. The office returned to its rhythm, though it now hummed at a slightly different frequency. Nora's presence, though never boastful, had become a quiet pillar, something staff watched and referenced, even if they never said her name aloud. The Cross River project launched on schedule, and with every milestone reached, her voice became the one that steered the room. She eventually accepted the role on the Integrity Committee, not because she wanted control, but because she had seen what silence and hesitation could do to truth. On her first day in the new position, she entered the room early and sat at the head of the table before anyone else arrived. She reviewed the charter slowly, and with each line, she rewrote it in her head, not with legal jargon, but with lived experience. No more shortcuts. No more unchallenged decisions passed off as protocol. If the company wanted to survive, it needed to bleed for its mistakes, even if only through reform. That afternoon, as she left the building, a junior staff member, barely out of NYSC, stopped her near the elevator. She looked nervous, clutching a notepad. "Ma," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you. A lot of us saw what happened. We just didn't know what to do." Nora smiled faintly and nodded. "Then learn to speak." even when your voice shakes. The girl smiled back. The elevator dinged. Nora stepped in alone and let the doors close behind her. She didn't know where her story would go next. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of turning the page. When people laugh at your downfall, let their laughter become your silence. Don't rush to explain yourself to those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Keep your head low, but your spirit high. Truth has a voice, and when the time is right, it will speak louder than every whisper behind your back. Don't fight dirty. Just stay ready. Because when the table turns, it won't need noise, just presence. May you never be buried by falsehood or broken by betrayal. May every setup against you turn into a divine stage for your rising. May God give you wisdom to remain calm, strength to endure the storm, and clarity to strike at the right time. Where others are removed, may you be remembered. Where doors are shut in your face, may favor fling them wide open. In rooms where your name is mocked, may it return crowned with honor. And when it's your season to rise, may nothing stand in your way. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.